Hello everyone and welcome to this Fantasy Fellowship author Q&A session. My name's Rob and joining me today for this Q&A is debut fantasy author Hannah Kaner. We are recording this ahead of time, but Hannah's debut novel Godkiller comes out on the day this video goes live, which is the 19th of January. Godkiller starts off following a renowned godkiller, Kisen, embarking on a quest filled with wild gods, demons, knights, civil war, and unexpected friends. Along the way, Kisen is joined by a noble girl, a little god of white lies, and a disillusioned knight on a secret quest. And to quote the book, they will all face a reckoning. Something is rotting at the heart of their world, and only they can be the ones to stop it. I was fortunate enough to get hold of this copy of the book before it was released. I had been in a bit of a reading slump, and reading Godkiller was such a captivating read. It pulled me right out of that slump. I absolutely loved it. So welcome, Hannah. It's great to have you with us. And when you're ready, we will crack on with the questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us, and yeah, almost making me cry before we even start. So cheers for that. Thank you for having me.
So if you're going to introduce or sell your book to someone who hasn't read it before or heard of it, what would you say? And no spoilers if we can avoid them.
I mean, yeah, and the book is about Kitten, who is a woman who kills gods for a living and enjoys it until she finds a god she can't kill. That was sort of the first pitch I put together for the book, and it has sort of held true. So that's how I'd say I start the story. It's a quest with this god killer at its heart, and that's how I pitch it. God killer finds a god she can't kill. She has to go to a ruined city where gods once lived and find a way to separate a girl from the god that's attached to her, so she can save the girl and kill the god. But then shenanigans ensue and everything goes tits up.
I say the name of the book very much is apt, isn't it? The Godkiller comes up very often. So reading Godkiller, I thought it was quite a unique book. I couldn't quite put my finger on what made it unique, but it just felt very different to what I'd read in the past. What were your inspirations for the story in Godkiller?
I think I went into it wanting to write like a classic quest story, so like The Hobbit or Gawain and the Green Knight or the Aeneid, and I also wanted to play with the sort of the wandering hero trope from Aragorn, if we're going to go into Lord of the Rings, or the Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss. I really and I suppose Geralt in The Witcher, which is often being used as a comparison. I love that trope of the kind of grumpy, jaded hero who has to sort of often end up having to find something to care about. And so Kisten was that hero at its heart, the first one, but then I wanted it to be challenged and changed as she goes on this quest, which was going to be a sort of a there and back again. And by that, kind of other heroes sort of came out of the woodwork. So you've got Elagast, the once knight, so a very traditional hero, but turned baker, who's laid down his sword. You've got the coming of age for Inara, who is a noble girl who is on the run but has secret powers of her own. And then the god itself that refuses to be killed, the god of white lies. So I really enjoy those classic quest stories. Is something that really speaks to me, and you get to journey through a world as you're experiencing it. So I wanted that, and then to combine that with sort of some tropes I could play with, some tropes I could really lean into. Was that was really the core of the inspiration behind it.
So I think we have to talk about the cover of Godkiller, because it's as soon as the cover came out, I think everybody I knew was talking about it. It seemed to get the biggest hype ever. That cover, it's such a beautiful cover, and I think it influenced many people to buy the book before they even read the blurb.
I know, right? People are going to buy it and like not even care what it's about. This is pretty.
It's pretty, and obviously special editions are going to come out of it because it was such a good cover. Yeah, there's going to be special editions, broken bindings, waterstones, everything. So how much interaction did you have with that cover design? Was it completely up to the artist, or did you work with them?
Well, overall, very, very little. Essentially, my editor said, "Have you looked at this artist? We're considering them for the cover. What do you think?" And I don't think I've ever said yes to anything so quickly in my life. Like, I love Tom's work. Like, and it also really conveys that sort of sense of like mystery and old gods and sort of and so the rest of his work is often on Instagram. He does prints of it, and it does have that sense of sort of mystery and magic about it that just felt perfect. But apart from that, I think the design, what was chosen to go into the cover, a huge amount of that came from the creative team in Harper Voyager, who had this vision for the book and how it would sell and work together, and they kind of communicated mainly with Tom. So in some parts of it as well, there were elements of which creative decisions were made in the cover that impacted themes that I brought even more out of the book, because I wanted to kind of, I guess, do it justice. So yeah, I didn't have much design impact on the cover, but I think I'm so lucky with how gorgeous it is and how the team pulled it together and how bloody talented and meticulous Tom is as well. And it really brought out the elements of the book that I sort of wanted to convey. So yeah, absolutely magic.
Yeah, it is a very nice cover.
I do have ideas for book 2 though.
No.
Like, do I get to like give these ideas? But I don't know.
It's got a lot to live up to.
I'm not the creative person in terms of
yeah.
artistic license, so.
Yes, I've got the broken binding version on the way, so I'm looking forward to having that on the shelf.
Oh yeah, that has the full colour map in it as well.
Yes, yeah.
I did have an influence on that, mainly because I had to say like where all the places
where
were.
Everything was.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it picked it just for me. The Waterstones one, it's got the sprayed edge. It was the color map, because I don't tend to have my books facing edge out on my shelf anyway, so it was the color map that did it for me.
Yeah, it's a really, really lovely addition. I really like the boards for it. It's like white with like all these inside the dust jacket as well.
Oh yes, yeah.
Really like that.
So moving on to the next question. There's an impressive amount of representation for disabilities within Godkiller. I think of amputees, there's sign language being used, of mental health issues that have PTSD feature quite heavily in quite a lot of the characters. Did you write Godkiller with the intention of including all of these, or was it something that evolved naturally as the story developed?
I didn't write Godkiller with the intention of writing a disabled protagonist or multiple disabilities in the book. But when I was writing the first scenes of the book, in which kind of you sort of get the reason behind, well, one of the reasons behind why Kissen, the main character, doesn't like gods and very much enjoys killing them. And I was figuring out the lore of the world and how things would work. And I realized in those scenes that she was going to have to lose something important. It would and something, it might have been a hand, it might have been an eye, and in this I decided that it was going to be a leg. She would be able to still have use of her hands, but this was going to be part of her character. However, realizing that I was going to be writing a disabled character, I found it was my responsibility to do it well. And so I did a lot of reading and investigation into tropes that disabled readers find really frustrating. So if it's kind of like that fix-it trope, like kind of your disability is something to be fixed. One of it is that often disabled characters are isolated, or even if they're scarred, like scars are usually like connected to being like the bad guy. You know, you watch any James Bond in recent years, it comes up time and time again. So I did a lot of reading into that, and also what it was like to have a limb difference and to be an amputee. And then worked with authenticity editors as well to bring that out. So knowing it was part of the character, I wanted to work really hard to try and represent her experience well. And I also as a kind of key point, I didn't want her to be alone. A lot of my friends who are disabled, they seek out communities of people who understand them and see them as they are and love them as they are. And often people who have had similar or shared experiences. So I thought it was kind of important that Kissen had a family who loved her, and where like how, and I sort of started to bring into ideas of how these people met each other and how they got together and what has bound them together as a fan family over so long. So it was kind of that one instance in the first, like we're figuring out the first chapter just had a huge number of essentially repercussions throughout the narrative that became more and more important to the character. as it went along. So I hope I've done it justice, and I hope the authenticity editors are proud of how I've brought in their personal experiences. But yeah, it felt like an honor to write it and to write this character and to make sure she was loved.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It definitely comes across the detail. There's a noticeable amount of detail when you're talking about the disabilities, especially with her leg. You know how it feels all the time. It is brought up quite a lot, and it feels very realistic because of that. It's not just, you do get some books, some literature where there's been a life-altering injury, but it doesn't really seem to affect the story too much, and the characters tend to do things which you kind of think, well, would they really be able to do that considering what they've done? Whereas it's always brought to the forefront when, even though Kirsten is this very skilled fighter, renowned Godkiller, it still trips her up. Excuse the pun, but it still trips her up.
Yeah,
even
I
years
mean, I
later.
definitely attribute some of that to, or a lot of that to the authenticity editors, who kind of, some points where I was like writing something like la da 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 da, she did this, and then the authenticity editor was like, please, dear God, no. And or what like kind of phantom pain feels like. Actually, my two authenticity editors disagreed on that. But that's it. It's like there's no singular experience of being disabled or being an amputee. So it was, yeah, it's definitely wanted to be something that was part of her character, and also just, you know, part of her life, and she's sort of accepted that as who she is, and it's great. She loves who she is. She's like, it's just, I am who I am is what she says more than once. And you also talked like about mental health and mental well, health issues to do with like PTSD, which is features in another character, which is Elogast, or Elo. And that also kind of came out of the character, like when I first was writing the story, I knew kind of like how I wanted his story to go, but then figuring out the motivations behind that, the sort of additions behind his character, and you know what made him tick, what made him act the way that he does, and you know the life that he has experienced, like what impact that's had. So again, it felt like a natural thing to be part of his story.
Yeah, again, I was gonna ask that again if before we move on to the next question. But yeah, it's another one that's it's very well done within the book, and it seems very authentic. So moving on, so still on the topic of representation. So I should probably talk about the queer representation within the book. So personally, I found it quite inspiring how naturally it was integrated into the story. It seemed it was almost just an ingrained part of the Godkiller world. So I guess it's the same question as the previous one, really. Was that something that just evolved naturally, or was it something you were writing that you personally wanted and purposely wanted to include in that book?
Yeah, I suppose that would probably be the opposite. I think it was intentional, and sort of something I went into writing fantasy. When I was growing up reading fantasy, I often found the worlds that I was reading to be very antagonistic to people, well, people like me, being queer, being a woman, that if you're a woman, you are often at risk of threats of sexual violence, of assault, of being diminished because of your femininity, and being queer, you're often isolated, and they have to hide who you are and be often the butt of jokes, or kind of an incredibly tragic story that's often comes into fantasy. And I think kind of that is changing. There's some brilliant queer fantasy that's been coming out over the last few years. It's just been an absolute breath of fresh air to read. And writing Godkiller, I wanted the world to feel, well, to not be about that, not be about kind of like the dangers you'd face by being queer in this world, or in this sort of, I guess, Middle Ages Renaissance-esque timeline. So for me, it was kind of intentional. I wanted to feel people to feel welcome. I wanted to feel welcome in the world that I was writing, and that you are who you are, and that's good. That's okay. I think, yeah, I wanted to write a queer norm world, and went into Godkiller with the intention of doing that.
It's funny you say that it's not about that, because that's almost the how I was trying to think of it. That it's almost that it's not about there being queer people in the world. The way you read it, it's that's not the focus. It's just that's just how it is. There's no. It's really difficult to put into words how you feel when you read it. I think people understand when they read it, but
I think there are like there's still huge value in exploring kind of the difficulties that queer people face in and outside of fantasy. And there are books that, you know, will still write about those challenges of being ostracized or excluded, and they're still really valuable and important when they're done well. I think it was just with this one in particular, I wanted it to be a bit of escapism and a bit of fun. So I wanted people to read it thinking, okay, I'm not going to be attacked by being in here. Like, a lot of the differences or conflicts between the characters are driven by what they think and what they believe in, not about necessarily just about who they are.
Brilliant. So moving on to mythology. Obviously, the book's called Godkiller, so we're going to touch on mythology. So it gives clues, of course. There's gods in the book. There's godlike creatures in the book. Did you pull from any specific mythologies to construct your gods? And do you have an interest in mythology yourself as well?
Oh, hell yeah. I mean,
Good.
I feel like mythos and mythology is such like a foundational aspect of a huge amount of fantasy writing. Like, kind of, it's a lot of where our magic and where our tropes come from. I mean, I grew up reading sort of Greek, Norse, Celtic myths, and definitely some of those kind of play in. We've got a god of war who isn't Ares, but kind of, you know, has some of those elements and ideas behind it. And then I did bring in some of the wild gods that are closer to Celtic gods or spirits, I suppose. So I brought in like kind of, there's a god of the hunt who in my head is like Hyn the Hunter. And I just kind of, it's kind of like an Easter egg to myself of these sort of spirits who kind of exist in our mythologies and kind of exist in those as well. So there's definitely sort of elements that I really wanted to bring out a little bit. And I think hugely for me is also the capriciousness and like pettiness of gods, like in particularly like Norse and Greek mythology, how they are tricksters and arrogant and powerful. Like, humans just have to kind of deal with the fact that they're these incredibly powerful beings who might take a liking to one person or disliking to another and turn them into a cow. So I definitely pulled on like those kind of old myths and legends from various world mythologies. But I think particularly those ones, I guess, more local to me. So Celtic and Norse played definitely a good strong aspect in who I was imagining as different gods, and when I was trying to think of different gods that were involved in the war and where they came from, who they were.
Skedi, a little god of white lies, is a very, very special character in the book, and he goes on quite a developmental journey as well. Was there any particular significance behind the creatures that gave him his form, or those different aspects of him?
So Skedi was based on a German and I think kind of American myth, tall tale, fable of a Wolpertinger or a jackalope, which is is a hare with a bird's wings and a deer's antlers. So that's kind of where the idea came. I mean, I love this. I mean, I live in Scotland. We've got the sort of tall tales of haggis, little fluffy beasties that run around hills with one leg shorter than the other. And the Wolpertinger is quite similar. It's kind of you go out in the wild, you might find a Wolpertinger. So I love this idea of Skedi as a god of white lies is kind of based on the sense of what white lies are from and what they're used for, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill. But that it was based on that German myth of essentially kind of this creature that doesn't really exist, but it's kind of told as a tale to entertain children or trick newcomers. And so that's where the god came from. He's an exact replica of a Wolpertinger. I'm actually going to get a Wolpertinger tattoo in February.
Oh wow, really?
just to bring it to a full circle.
Well, you can't say it won't have meaning, can you? It's
certainly.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's such a kind of, I love fables, and I think kind of superstitions and myths are also aspects of kind of stories that we tell each other that really bring our world and our history to life. And I really wanted to bring Skedi to life through that as well. I have had a couple of people who've messaged me being like, "Is Skedi Wolpertinger, is he?" And I'm like, "Yeah, you got it."
Brilliant. So leaving the gods behind and looking at Inara. So it's such a unique. I touched on it before about those unique aspects of the book. I couldn't really put my finger on, and one of them is I think Inara's ability. So that it's very unique that she can see the colors of characters around her. How did you come up with that?
Yeah, that was I suppose it started with trying to figure out, well, this is probably a bit nerdy, but like the science behind, obviously it's a magical world, but the science behind like kind of what gives gods their energy and their power, like what is their connection to humans. And one of those, like Skedi can see the colors too, is that humans have their emotions are energy, and when people pray or give faith to a god, that energy is like kind of transferred essentially to that god and gives them shape, gives them meaning, and memory and purpose. So with Inara kind of being able to see the colors as being able to see people's emotions around her that gods have often chosen to can manipulate or use to kind of read people. And I like that sort of sense of almost omniscience that I can give a god. And in the book, her understanding is that she's kind of gained these powers by being connected to Skedi. That's not necessarily the case, but it was kind of having her have one foot in the human world and one foot in a god's world, and kind of see people from both angles. And so her being able to see with the god's sight was kind of an important development aspect of her character, as well as something that she needs to hide about herself in a world where gods are illegal. But I guess when I think about people and writing and how people convey or express their emotions, like a lot of time you spend reading people's minutest facial expressions and the way they move their head a bit differently, or their mouth turns down when they're annoyed or concentrating. And I guess I just kind of wanted to give that a more physical aspect in the colors. But then I also thought about having colors that were like, consistent, like red is angry, like green is envy, kind of like we have agreed a lot across a lot of Western canon, but not necessarily across the world. But it felt more true to life that people see themselves differently, and have different colors with different meanings. So I think that was kind of also a motive difference between what Kitten could hide and what other people express. So that's kind of, it's something that I'm going to bring out a little bit more as the books go along.
Yeah, I think Ilagast's colours are very unique to him, based on his past. I won't say too much for people who haven't read it yet, but based on what he went through, his colours are unique to him, and that's pulled up quite a lot in the book, isn't it? So Inara tends to notice that and wonders about it. So someone who read this book alongside me, Louise, sent this question to me. I didn't actually notice this, but she did. So the food in Godkiller is very detailed and described quite often. So does writing make you snacky, or did it end up bleeding into the stories you were writing, or are you just a big foodie?
I'm just a big foodie. I love. I'm probably happiest when I'm eating or cooking, and I love kind of foods from around the world and how like different tastes fit together, and how kind of it's also something that we share with each other, like from across different cultures of like kind of you gather around the table and you eat in different ways and you have different foods that you maybe your grandma handed down to you. Um, So for me, like food has a huge amount of meaning, and it also is part of, well, I guess in the way that myths travel around the world through people telling stories, like going down the Silk Roads and myths being passed and stories being passed as people are traveling on merchant trains. Is also how food has got around the world. Like in sort of a lot of Arabic influences are in like the south of Spain because it was a predominantly or largely Arabic area, with foods that are kind of sort of now blended between different cultures, across North Africa and southern Spain, and that was kind of a beautiful thing to kind of see how food comes together and shows that kind of connection across landscapes. So I guess for me, like the gods in the book and the food in the book are kind of connected. Like Elo's connection to food is to his home and his mother's, and also kind of like his sense of peace and stability in himself. Um, and so I like to bring the element of travel, like how did the gods get to Midran? It was through trade. How did all these foods get to Midran? Also through trade. So it kind of they felt like intrinsically connected. Um, and a couple of times I was eating or like had just eaten before I started writing a passage, and I was like, oh, I'm going to factor that in.
So on that, following up on food, while we're talking about it, do you have a favorite reading or writing snack?
Um, I tend to forget to eat when I'm writing. So usually it's like if I'm really into it, it'll be just whatever's closest. It'll probably be toast and jam, or toast and peanut butter and jam if I'm feeling really fancy. But yeah, I definitely don't often snack while writing, mainly because all the crumbs end up in the keyboard, and also it distracts me from what I'm doing. I'd love to do that. I'd love to have like a perfect snack, like an array of grapes and cheeses and something. But really, it's just whatever I can get my hands on.
No, fair enough.
Food requires concentration.
Can't be a side thought or an afterthought. It has to have full attention.
My full attention needs to go on the food, exactly.
So Godkiller itself, it isn't a huge novel. It's around 300 pages. Did you always plan to write it as part of a trilogy? And do you have the trilogy mapped out already?
No, I did not always plan it as start of a trilogy. I intended it as a duology. I kind of I said there and back again was the sort of the quest or the hero's journey. So my first book was going to be there, and the other book was going to be back again, which probably wasn't a good idea, but felt great to me. But then, I was talking to my agent about, the extent of the story and the potential breadth of the world. And a trilogy just felt more natural, more classic fantasy. So yeah, it was kind of, she was like, could you just do a synopsis for the next 2 books? And I did it overnight, essentially. I was kind of like, okay, well, this is what I planned out. But I think, as with all things, it changes as you write, and the kind of threads that you pull out in book 1 while editing and then start to put into book 2 are going to also have an impact on book 3, and in order of magnitude as well. So it definitely kind of has expanded, and it will continue to. So I've got a pretty good idea what's happened in the second book because I drafted it. Third book, definitely some overall structural what's going to happen. I've got a fairly strong idea of the ending, but all the little in-between bits I haven't quite figured out yet.
I'm looking forward to book 2 because I was sent the manuscript because obviously interviewing you. I sent the manuscript a couple months ago, a month or so ago, and because I was reading it in PDF format, I wasn't paying attention to the page numbers, and then the story just ended, and I was just.
I'm sorry.
So,
it's gone.
Yeah, so it was a surprise ending for me. I didn't expect it to end like that.
Yeah, I mean, it felt like a natural end to that journey, but it's a very short book. As you say, 300 pages for an adult fantasy novel is not common. It did feel like the story came to its natural conclusion where it ended, but with the intention of the next stage of the story picks up pretty much where it left off.
Oh, thank God. So we've spoken to a few authors about their writing style. Some tend to let the actions of the character develop as the plot goes on. Others tend to stick to a strict plan, and characters will behave themselves. And what is your writing style?
I suppose I don't know how to describe it. Generally the first draft I'll do is me telling the story to myself. So it'll be a lot of speech, a lot of arguments, a lot of someone needs to somehow get to this place kind of thing. But it's essentially telling me my own story, no matter how terrible it is, and trying to get words onto a page. And then that's basically like a lump of clay that's there that I've sort of got the vague idea of what I'm going to do with it. And then each draft, so before I even send it to an editor, I've usually drafted it 2 or 3 times. Each draft, I kind of hone the story, figure out voice, figure out motivation, and and then often change what was in the original based on like kind of, well, that doesn't make sense for that character to do that. It's not in their nature. So rewriting it essentially from the point of view of kind of like, this is more natural to this character, this makes more sense. And then sometimes like, okay, we've had 6 pages of conversations now. I think we're going to delete all those and just have a sword fight instead. So yeah, I guess it's kind of I mold the story as I go along, and then I reshape it and reshape it and reshape it over and over, often with contributions from beta readers or friends or people who will read those early drafts and give me honest opinions, and then by the editing team as well, who will ask me questions that I'm too nervous to ask myself, such as, why does this work the way it does? So yeah, definitely. I don't know if there's a word for that. I know there's like pantsing or planning, or there's gardener or architect. I guess it's a bit of both.
Okay.
I pants plan, then I plan pants.
Do you ever find that, were you ever writing and one of your characters, it just didn't fit into the scenario that you'd put them in, and they ended up doing something unexpected that you weren't planning
Absolutely,
for?
yeah. It was like you're writing this thing and you're like, these guys should do something. And then you're like, that just doesn't make sense for who they are. And then sometimes you kind of end up writing your characters into a really crappy situation, and now they have to do something about it. And you're like, oh no, I'm so sorry. But yeah, no, I've absolutely written scenes that just don't fit as well with the character or as the character is developed. I think Elo in particular took a long time to figure out who he was and what motivated him. And I think I sort of discovered him as I wrote, and he became a so much more whole person. As I kept questioning myself and challenging my own writing and saying, this doesn't make sense, this motivation doesn't make sense, this interaction is not quite there. So I think he ended up with a lot of nuance, which is a lot harder to write, I think, than extroversion and anger, which Kissen has. And it was just very, it's easy to write anger and reaction, but a lot of what happens with Elo is internal. So allowing him that space, but also him being funny, him being very impressive, and him being a warrior. So that was it was hard to do.
It is. I touched on the developmental journeys that the characters gone through before, but considering the size of the book, the journeys the characters go on within themselves, as well as the physical journey they do, it's very impressive how you manage to move them along as far as they've come in such a short space, or physical page space anyway. Yeah, it was quite impressive. Are they the people you expected them to be at the end of the book that you were planning them to be?
I think largely I knew what the end of their journeys were going to be, and that was quite delightful. How they got there was definitely a bit harder. So yeah, I think kind of knowing where they were going to end up and what that was going to trigger next, like what the kind of ricochet effect of that would be, was definitely something I had in my head. So yeah, there are some elements where I wish I'd been able to kind of dive a lot more into the characters and their backgrounds and all the things they did. There's a lot still in my head that never made it onto the page and then deleted. But then it's also kind of, you really want to keep people moving along the story and not kind of keep them too long in the past or keep them too long arguing around campfires. So yeah, it was attempting to be quite a concise book.
Cool. So still staying on your writing, so obviously it's your debut novel. What has your journey been to get to this point, your writing journey? How has it been?
Well, this is my 7th book I've written.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, the first couple I wrote when I was a wee obsessive 14-year-old who was like, I'm going to write a fantasy book. And since then, I've been writing books with the hope of getting them published sort of over and over. I signed with my agent, I guess, on my 3rd full-length book. But that one didn't get picked up by publishers. And there was a few more after that until we came to this one. So I guess with Juliet, I've been 9 years with Juliet as one of her authors, and she's been incredibly supportive and incredibly driven to make sure I keep going. Every time you get knocked back, just pick up the pen or the keyboard and start from the beginning. I think a huge amount of persistence needs to go into being an author and a good author as well, because you've got to kind of revisit what you've done and change it and learn to grow and adapt as a writer. I think I'm still very early in that journey. I think I've still got a huge amount to learn. But it has been a long process of figuring out who I was going to be as a writer as well.
Cool.
Did almost give up a couple of times, but I didn't.
Oh, I'm glad you didn't. The previous books, are they an influence on Godkiller, or are they completely different stories?
They're actually really different. I think often, I think elements of mythology do play some part into other books, but no, each one has been pretty different. I do have a tendency to enjoy writing sort of mountain or forest scenes. I really like nature, so kind of plays into it. But no, very, very different stories.
Okay. So if you could have the world of Godkiller published in any sort of other media, what would it be? Have you ever thought about it before, like a series, movie, or a video game?
Oh, if I think in the world, it would make a cracking video game.
Yes, I thought the same.
I guess I grew up playing like Final Fantasy and Assassin's Creed, and it kind of, yeah, that would be pretty cool.
Yeah.
And to kind of have people, I guess, create their own Godkillers and their own kind of journey. I mean, the book itself, it would be freaking amazing to see it as a film, which is probably the media that I consume the most. But a video game would be pretty cool for the world.
I did, once I'd finished it and I was thinking about these questions, to me it would be the perfect, almost like a Skyrim type game where you could choose your type of character. So you could be a god if you wanted, and you could be a little mini god, or you could be a hunter, you could be a knight. And then it's an open world game, so you could go where you want and you meet these gods in the wild and things like that. It sounded like a great game to me. So if anyone wants to buy that game and get Hannah to make it, that'd be great.
I think I need cleverer people than me to design the storylines and the quests and things, because I don't know how much brain goes into video games, but I just don't understand how all these different things can fit together. Yes. I can write one storyline. One at a time.
That's okay. You only need one main storyline. You can have side quests. It's fine.
That's true. It's true.
So going a bit off piece now, away from Godkiller. If you could only read one book for the rest of your life, so stranded on a desert island type scenario with one book, what would it be and why?
I'm really glad you sent me this before, because I've gone through about 18 different books, and each for different reasons. But one thing that kind of I read really recently, so I'm just going to go for that. Well, I reread it actually. It's Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino, whose name I probably just butchered. And it's basically, it's speculative fiction, but it's imagining the stories that would have been the conversations that would have been had between Marco Polo and Kublai Khan. And in these stories, like Marco Polo is describing different cities, city after city after city after city. And it sort of turns out, isn't really a spoiler, but it's such an old book, but that what he's really describing is home. And it seems like the perfect home for him was Venice. It just seemed like a perfect, I guess, trigger for memory if you're stuck on a desert island, is like you can reimagine and recreate home in your mind over and over again. So it's really tiny though, so probably wouldn't make very good kindling, but you know, it's supposed to be reading it.
Take Lord of the Rings along with you, it's fine, that'll keep you busy. So if you were going to recommend 2 or 3 books to our community, what would they be and why? And as a part 2 to that, do you have any books that you'd recommend that you feel are really underrated or not very well heard of, that you think people should read?
Okay. Fantasy specifically?
Fantasy doesn't have to be fantasy. We are a fantasy book club, so
Yeah.
people would probably enjoy fantasy
Stick with fantasy.
recommendation.
Because okay, so fantasy, I'd recommend One for All by Lillie Lainoff, which is like a feminine Three Musketeers with a disabled sword-wielding protagonist, but written by a disabled sword-wielding author. And it's a brilliant kind of reimagining of that era in France from a woman's perspective, and it's a great story. It's a great romp, and it's brilliantly told. And yeah, I would really highly recommend it. I've got to say, this book isn't a fantasy book, but it's such like a fun thing to read around sort of fantasy world building. And it's called The Map of Knowledge, which is like a history of the world in 7 cities, and it's by someone called Violet Moller. And it's about our world and how knowledge was, or like texts were transferred from Alexandria to Baghdad to Cordoba and like how different philosophies were kind of like kept and changed and retranslated between that. And I loved its descriptions of different cities at those times. So it's like history of the world in 7 cities. And it was just such a great kind of idea of this living, breathing, exciting world before the Renaissance, and it's a huge world as well. And how sort of stories and Silk Roads and trade all sort of combine together. So I think it's just a wonderful book, and I just love the way that kind of like lands and history and mythology all work together. And particularly interesting is kind of like the run of trade through the Mediterranean, trade and knowledge. And I just think, yeah, it's a brilliant way to kind of look at the world in a different way, and fantasy worlds in a different way as well. I think as a writer, brilliant book. And the last one is got to be The Final Strife by Saara El-Arifi, which is like a chosen one tale gone wrong, trial for supremacy. It's like huge in its scope and world, but like you see the world like in the first book through the sort of like narrow perspective of what the characters are in, and the second book I think is going to expand that a little bit, and I'm so excited for the battle drum. So The Final Strife is brilliant.
Yeah, we're doing another YouTube video shortly after this, which is our most anticipated reads, and the battle drum is on there. Godkiller's actually on there as well. You'd be happy to know.
Battle drum, I'm so keen for it. The US cover looks brilliant. I'm not sure what the UK one will be yet. It should be, yeah, anticipation.
I've seen the red one. Is that the US cover? The red cover.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I've seen that one. But yeah, I haven't seen the UK one yet. It's still saying cover pending.
Yeah, I think it's still being designed.
Interesting.
And the other one was books you think are underrated or not well heard of. There is a trilogy that I read a while ago, and I am, friends with the author, so there may be some bias in here of the fact that I just think they are a fantastic writer. But El Lam wrote this trilogy called, well, it's Pantomime, Shadow Play, and Masquerade, and it was published in 2014, so kind of before this rising tide that we're currently on with queer books and LGBTQIA books and fiction, with a queer, intersex, and trans protagonist. And it's a really beautiful world, and it's navigated through circus and magic and trickery, and it was such like kind of a before its time book, even though I know it's only 10 years ago. But it's, yeah, I just don't think it's as well known as it should be. I think it is brilliant, and Elle is such a talented writer. So if you kind of, it's YA, so if you're looking for YA fantasy in another world, and yeah, queer tropes are, or not tropes, but queer characters and characterization is really important to you, I'd highly recommend it. And it's a complete trilogy as well, so it's all done.
Yeah, everyone loves a complete trilogy. We
Yeah.
actually had one of L.L. Lamb's books actually on that list as well. You mentioned it, it's reminded me.
Oh, is it Dragonfall?
Yes, yeah.
Yes. I've been reading that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's really good.
Oh, thank God. So, final question. What can we expect from you next? Obviously, book 2 is on the way. And you've mentioned book 3. Is there more worlds you want to write about? Or are you going to focus on the Godkiller world and the story there for a bit?
I feel I shouldn't tell you about other worlds until I tell my editor and agent.
But there are other worlds then.
There are absolutely, there's always other worlds.
Of course.
Yeah, there's definitely kind of some other ideas that I'm really excited to explore, but right now I really want to, yeah, pursue this trilogy to its end. So yeah, book 2 is a tricky beast, because in book 1 all the characters are together, and in book 2 they're mostly apart and all have their own journeys, and I'm still trying to keep it to around 300 pages. So that's going to be interesting. And then book 3, I think, is going to get bigger again. And I love that in fantasy trilogies, where you kind of get that first sliver of the world in book 1, then it grows a bit and things get more complicated, and it grows a bit and gets a bit more bombastic in book 3. So I think that's really what you can probably expect from me.
Excellent. It's obviously it's a little bit in the future, but do you think you'd ever come back to, once you've finished your trilogy, come back to Godkiller to fill in, do some side stories that fill any gaps in, or do you feel like the trilogy is everything that you're going to do in that world?
Oh, I could never say no, could I? Like, there's so much backstory and interaction and history with all of these characters, like Kissin when she first trained to be a god killer, or Kissin when she escaped from Blyn Raiden the first time, or Elo going into war and chaos with just as like kind of his best friend at his side, and then having to take over essentially an army. And then Inara's mother has some very interesting backstories as well, that it's just, yeah, there's so much you can't fit onto the page, and that I don't know, I'll probably end up writing them just for myself, to be honest.
I say that it does come across as a big tease sometimes. Book 1, there's so many little things that get mentioned, and you kind of want to dig a bit deeper, but then you also know you've got to move the story on and keep going with them on their journey.
Yeah. Oh well, maybe one day.
Thank you everyone for listening in, and thank you for Hannah for joining us today. If you want to get involved in the Fantasy Fellowship community, you can join our Discord, which is linked in the description below. We are also on Instagram, where we are at fantasy_fellowship, and Twitter, where we are at fanfellowship. We have a website, which is www.fantasy-fellowship.co.uk. And make sure you do head over to our Instagram after watching this, because we will be looking to give away a copy of Godkiller. So make sure you enter that competition. If you enjoyed listening to this Q&A, make sure to hit like, and if you want to keep up to date with more content from Fantasy Fellowship, hit the subscribe button. Thanks again. Bye.